All right, let's talk about something that gets a lot of buzz: spiritual warfare. Now, when I say that, you probably have some pretty intense, dramatic images popping into your head, right? But what if the real picture is less about Hollywood-style combat and more about something, well, something far more fundamental? What if it's really a cosmic struggle for who's in charge, for our allegiance? Let's dive in.
Seriously, when you hear that phrase, what's the first thing that comes to mind? For so many of us, it's probably those dramatic movie scenes, right? Exorcisms, epic power encounters, head-to-head clashes with dark forces. And look, our source material today isn't saying that stuff isn't real, but it is suggesting that this popular view might be missing the main point entirely.
And this slide, wow, this really gets to the heart of it. On the left, you've got that popular view we just talked about: ritual combat, power encounters, a big focus on exorcism. But the framework our source presents, over on the right, it's a completely different game. It's all about allegiance, public witness, and proclaiming the gospel. Getting our heads around this huge shift from combat to allegiance, that's what this is all about.
So let's just set aside the Hollywood version for a few minutes. To really get what's going on, we need a new frame of reference. One that sees this whole conflict not as a bunch of random skirmishes, but as one long cosmic struggle over a single massive question: who has the right to rule?
And here is that new frame, right here. This is the foundational definition from our source. I mean, just look at the language here. A conflict between two households, or you could say two kingdoms. And what's the prize? It's not just one person's soul here or there. It's the allegiance of the nations. This completely shifts the battlefield from inside a person's head to the public square of all humanity.
So you gotta ask, where did a conflict this big even come from? Well, to understand the war, we have to rewind all the way back to the very beginning, to the first time allegiance was ever up for grabs. The source describes the fall of humanity in a really interesting way. It wasn't just about breaking a rule, it was a vocational collapse. You see, humanity's job, our whole purpose, was to represent God's good and perfect rule here on earth. So that first sin wasn't just a mistake. It was a transfer of loyalty. It was a shift in allegiance away from the rightful king. And that one act corrupted human governance from the inside out.
And that first allegiance crisis had these massive cascading consequences. You can see it here. Humanity's allegiance shifts, and as a result, the nations get scattered under the influence of these rival spiritual rulers. Now, this completely reframes idolatry. It's not just a religious error anymore. The source calls it political treason. You're literally siding with a rival government. And the connection becomes so clear. When you have corrupt worship of false gods, you will inevitably get a corrupt and unjust society. It's cause and effect.
But here's the good news. The story does not end in rebellion. The whole narrative builds and builds towards a single decisive turning point, a victory that's described in these really specific, almost legal terms.
This verse from Colossians it's absolutely central to this whole thing. It talks about disarming and publicly disgracing these rival rulers. But how? How did that happen? It wasn't through some raw display of power. No, the way it happened was something so much more profound.
And to really get it, we have to understand this key term: juridical. All it means is that the victory was legal. Think of it like a verdict being handed down in a cosmic Supreme Court. It wasn't just that God was stronger, it's that his rival's entire legal case against humanity was systematically and completely dismantled.
Okay, so this slide breaks down the legal logic of the cross perfectly. It's brilliant. Step 1, humanity has this certificate of debt, basically a record of all our failures. Step 2, this debt gives hostile powers legal leverage, a right to stand before God and accuse us. But then, step 3, the cross comes and cancels that debt, satisfying God's justice once and for all. And the result? Step 4, the powers are disarmed. Once the debt is gone, the accusers have no legal leg to stand on. Their primary weapon, accusation, is stripped away.
Now, of course, this brings up the most obvious question, right? If these powers are defeated and disarmed, why does the world still feel like such a battleground? How can a disarmed enemy still seem so dangerous?
Our source just captures this tension perfectly with this line. The enemy is stripped, yet still hostile. Disarmed, yet still dangerous. Defeated, yet still active within limits. It's this already but not yet reality that we live in. The war is won, but the enemy hasn't fully surrendered yet.
So let's get really clear about those limits, what the enemy can and cannot do. On the one hand, they are not all powerful. Not even close. They absolutely cannot undo the victory of the cross. They cannot sever a believer from God. But on the other hand, they can still deceive and masquerade. They can accuse and tempt, and they can exploit what the Bible calls footholds, those areas of compromise in our lives. You see, knowing this should move us away from fear and toward a kind of sober, clear-eyed vigilance.
So, given this whole reality, a war that's already legally won, but with a foe that's still dangerous, what are we actually supposed to do? How does all this theology translate into a practical, everyday response? You might be surprised by this. The central command in the New Testament for spiritual warfare isn't to go on the attack. It's not to hunt down spirits or seek out confrontation. No, the primary verb, the one that's repeated over and over, is to stand, to hold your ground, to simply resist being moved from the victory that has already been won for you.
And this understanding totally reframes the famous armor of God passage. It's not a list of mystical charms. It's a beautiful metaphor for a life of faithful allegiance. The belt of truth, that's how we resist the enemy's main strategy, deception. The breastplate of righteousness is about waging war with our own ethical integrity. The shield of faith is a public demonstration of our allegiance, refusing the rival's story. The helmet of salvation anchors our identity so we can counter accusations. And the one offensive tool we have, the sword of the Spirit, is all about proclaiming God's word.
So, as we bring all of this together, the main thesis becomes crystal clear. This war has always been, and it continues to be, all about allegiance.
And that means your role in this huge cosmic conflict is played out in these seemingly ordinary ways. By proclaiming the good news of the King's victory. By resisting lies with truth. By just living a life of faithful obedience. By enduring when things get tough. At the end of the day, it's about steadfastly refusing to surrender the ground that Christ has already won.
And so that leaves us with one final and pretty crucial question. If the war is all about allegiance, and if worship is the ultimate expression of allegiance, then when you look at your own life, your time, your energy, your money, your devotion, where is your worship and therefore your loyalty truly directed? The answer to that question reveals everything about which side of this cosmic conflict we're really on.